Imagine an aircraft so ordinary-looking that you could walk past it in a museum without a second glance. And yet without it, half the world would never have taken to the skies. In 1945, more than 10,000 of these aircraft sat scattered across airfields on 5 continents, suddenly worthless to the militaries that built them. Within a few short years, that same aircraft would become the single most important machine in the history of civil aviation. You have probably flown on a route it invented, over an airline it created, using a business model it made possible. And almost nobody remembers its name. This is the story of the Douglas C-47, and how a machine built to drop paratroopers over Normandy ended up carrying the entire post-war airline industry on its wings. What happened to these aircraft after the war reshaped how humanity travels to this day. By the end, you will never look at a small regional airline, a crop duster, or even a cargo plane landing at your local airport the same way again. To understand why the C-47 mattered so much after the war, you have to understand what it was during the war. The aircraft began its life as something almost accidental, a civilian airliner called the DC-3, designed in 1935 after American Airlines pushed Douglas aircraft to build something bigger and more comfortable than anything flying at the time. Nobody at Douglas imagined they were designing a war machine. They were designing sleeper berths for wealthy transcontinental travelers. But when the United States entered the war, the Army Air Forces looked at that same airframe and saw something else entirely. A rugged twin-engine workhorse that could be reinforced, fitted with a reinforced floor, a cargo door wide enough to push out jeeps and howitzers, and a tail shortened to allow gliders to be towed behind it. They called it the C-47 Skytrain. The British called it the Dakota. The troops who flew and jumped from it called it the Gooney bird. Whatever the name, it became the backbone of Allied logistics. Over 10,000 were built between 1941 and 1945, produced simultaneously in Long Beach, in Santa Monica, and in a sprawling government plant in Oklahoma City that alone turned out more than 5,000 of them. General Dwight Eisenhower would later name the C-47 as one of the 4 pieces of equipment most responsible for winning the war, alongside the Jeep, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb. Read that list again. 3 of those are weapons. One of them is a cargo plane. That alone should tell you something about what this aircraft was capable of. The C-47 carried paratroopers into Normandy in the largest airborne assault ever attempted. It flew impossible cargo runs over the Himalayas, a route so dangerous the pilots simply called it flying the hump, hauling fuel and supplies from India into China when every other route into the country had been severed by the Japanese army. It towed gliders into Holland during Operation Market Garden. It hauled the wounded out of nearly every theatre of the war on stretchers bolted where paratroopers had once sat. It could take off from a dirt strip carved out of a jungle, land on a beach still under fire, and somehow keep flying home riddled with bullet holes. Pilots trusted it more than aircraft twice its size. And by the time Germany and then Japan surrendered, this rugged, unglamorous, endlessly reliable airplane had become, in the eyes of nearly every Allied pilot who flew it, the single most trusted machine in the sky. But trust doesn't pay the bills. And when the shooting stopped, the United States government suddenly found itself asking a very uncomfortable question. What do you do with 10,000 airplanes nobody needs anymore? The answer came fast, and it came with a kind of chaos that is almost impossible to picture today. Within months of Japan's surrender in August 1945, American war production simply stopped. Factories that had built engines and airframes around the clock went silent almost overnight. Airfields across the Pacific, across Europe, and across the continental United States filled up with row after row of parked aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, engines cold, waiting for someone in Washington to decide their fate. The United States alone found itself sitting on a surplus of nearly 100,000 aircraft of every type, worth billions of dollars, and almost none of it had any obvious peacetime use. Fighters and bombers, built for a single brutal purpose, were largely doomed. Many were flown directly to remote desert boneyards, stripped of anything valuable, and melted down for scrap aluminum, the very metal recycled straight back into pots, pans, and lawn furniture for the American households whose sons had just come home. But transport aircraft were different, and the C-47, more than almost anything else in that surplus fleet, had something the fighters and bombers never had. It had a civilian twin already waiting for it in the marketplace. Here is the detail almost nobody realizes. The C-47 was never really a warplane pretending to be useful. It was a civilian airliner, the DC-3, that had been drafted into military service and modified just enough to survive combat. Strip the cargo door reinforcement back down, remove the paratrooper jump seats, put in airline-style seating, and you essentially had a DC-3 again. This meant that when the War Assets Administration, the government agency created specifically to liquidate surplus military property, began looking for a way to dispose of these aircraft, the C-47 wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity. And that opportunity was about to collide with an industry that was desperate, broke, and hungry for exactly this kind of airplane. What nobody in Washington expected was just how fast that hunger would turn into a stampede. The disposal itself became one of the strangest bureaucratic dramas of the post-war years. The War Assets Administration was simultaneously being pressured from every direction. Struggling domestic airlines wanted cheap, reliable aircraft to expand routes that the war had frozen in place for 4 years. Foreign governments, many of them staring at economies flattened by occupation and bombing, wanted transport aircraft on credit or practically for free. Private buyers, opportunistic businessmen, and even a wave of small startup carriers wanted in on what quickly became one of the great fire sales of the 20th century. And the government itself was torn between two competing instincts: sell the aircraft fast to recover some value from a staggering wartime investment, or hold on to strategic reserves in case Cold War tensions, already simmering by 1946, boiled over into another conflict. Meetings were held, policies were drafted and abandoned. At one point, surplus C-47s that had cost the government well over $100,000 apiece to build were being sold to civilian buyers for as little as $2,500. Some went for even less once engines and instruments were stripped out for military reserve stock, leaving airframes practically given away to anyone who could put engines back in and fly them off the field. That price point changed everything. Before the war, buying an airliner was something only an established, well-capitalized carrier could dream of. After the war, for the cost of a modest house, an ambitious entrepreneur with a pilot's license and a hangar could own a genuine, war-tested 28-passenger transport aircraft capable of flying almost anywhere on Earth. This single fact, more than any other, is why the C-47 became the aircraft that built the modern airline industry. It didn't just give existing carriers cheap aircraft. It created an entirely new tier of aviation that had never existed before. Small, scrappy, regional and international operators who could never have afforded a new airliner, but who could absolutely afford a surplus Gooney bird with a fresh coat of paint and a company name stenciled on the fuselage. But this is where the story gets even stranger, because what happened next wasn't confined to America. It went global and fast. Picture an airfield in the Netherlands in 1946, half its runway still cratered from Allied bombing runs, and parked on the tarmac sites a former Royal Air Force Dakota, its military markings barely painted over, about to fly its first civilian passenger route into Amsterdam. Picture Australia, where returning servicemen with flying experience and almost no capital bought decommissioned Dakotas straight off military airstrips and began stitching together the first air routes to connect the vast, empty outback to the coastal cities, routes that had simply never existed before because no aircraft had ever been rugged enough or cheap enough to justify them. Nearly every airline and military force operating anywhere in the world during the late 1940s and 1950s flew the C-47 or its Dakota variant at some point, an astonishing statistic for a single aircraft type. In India and newly independent Pakistan, the very same C-47s that had flown supply runs over the hump were repurposed within months to carry troops and refugees during the chaos of partition in 1947, the same aircraft type serving both new nations simultaneously, sometimes flown by pilots who had trained together under the old Royal Air Force before independence split them into rival air forces. In Brazil, in Kenya, in Indonesia, in Ireland, in Hong Kong, surplus C-47s became the founding aircraft of national airlines that still exist today, though most travelers boarding their modern jets have no idea what type of aircraft first carried their airline's name into the sky. But that wasn't the strangest part. The C-47 didn't just become an airliner, it became the aircraft that made regional aviation, cargo aviation, and bush flying possible in places no other aircraft could survive. Its short landing distance and enormous, forgiving landing gear meant it could set down on grass strips, gravel bars, packed dirt, even frozen lakes. Operators in the Canadian Arctic and the Alaskan interior discovered that a C-47 could land where almost nothing else could, carrying mail, fuel, and supplies into communities that had never before had reliable air service. Missionary aviation groups bought surplus Dakotas to reach remote villages across Africa and South America. Geological survey companies used them to map territory that had never been properly charted from the air. Firefighting agencies eventually converted them into airborne water and retardant tankers, a role some of these airframes were still performing more than 60 years after they rolled off the Oklahoma City production line. A machine designed in 1935 and drafted for war in 1941 was still doing frontline aviation work in the 21st century, a service life longer than almost any powered aircraft in human history. And then there is the darker, stranger chapter of the disposal story, the one most documentaries never touch. Not every surplus C-47 found a dignified second career. Thousands were simply too far gone, damaged too badly in combat or by hard post-war handling to be worth restoring. Some were flown to remote storage fields and left to the elements, slowly sinking into the ground until scrap dealers arrived years later to melt them down. Others met even stranger fates. In parts of the Pacific, aircraft considered too costly to ship home were deliberately destroyed rather than surrendered to local buyers at low prices, bulldozed off cliffs or pushed into the ocean, a decision that still angers historians today, given how desperately some of the same aircraft could have served rebuilding communities nearby. Entire fleets of perfectly flyable transport aircraft were scrapped not because they were useless, but because shipping them home cost more than the government believed they were worth. It is one of the quiet tragedies buried inside this story. The very abundance that made the C-47 so cheap and so available to post-war airlines was, in some corners of the world, matched by an equally staggering waste of aircraft that never got the chance to fly again. Still, the sheer scale of what did survive is almost impossible to overstate. By the early 1950s, the DC-3 and C-47 family, counting every civilian and military variant produced, totaled more than 16,000 aircraft, including licensed versions built in the Soviet Union as the Lisunov Li-2 and in Japan as the Showa L-2D. No other transport aircraft in history had ever achieved that kind of global saturation. And because so many of the post-war civilian fleet were surplus military airframes rather than newly manufactured aircraft, the C-47 effectively subsidized the birth of dozens of airlines that otherwise could never have gotten off the ground financially in the ruined economies of the late 1940s. Ask any aviation historian which single aircraft did the most to democratize commercial flight after the Second World War, and almost every one of them will give you the same answer. Here is a detail that surprises even people who think they know this story well. The reason the C-47 stayed in frontline use for so long wasn't nostalgia. It was economics and reliability that modern aircraft simply couldn't match for certain missions. Its twin Pratt and Whitney radial engines were simple enough that mechanics anywhere in the world, in any country, with any level of infrastructure, could keep them running with basic tools and improvised parts. That single fact meant a C-47 could operate profitably on routes where a modern jet would be grounded for weeks, waiting on a replacement component shipped from a factory on the other side of the world. In Vietnam, some surplus airframes were pulled back into military service and converted into AC-47 gunships, nicknamed Spooky, bristling with rapid-fire miniguns, an almost unrecognizable transformation for an aircraft that had spent the previous decade quietly hauling passengers and freight for a regional airline. The same basic airframe that carried honeymooners on short hops across the Caribbean in 1955 was, in some cases, literally the very same production line's output that was raining suppressive fire over jungle battlefields a decade later. Few aircraft in history have lived two such wildly different lives. Consider the case of one particular carrier, born almost entirely out of this surplus disposal frenzy. In the years right after the war, a wave of new American airlines appeared almost overnight, most of them founded by former military pilots who had spent the war flying transport missions and simply couldn't imagine going back to an ordinary job. They pooled what little money they had, bought a handful of surplus C-47s straight off government storage fields, hired mechanics who had trained on the exact same aircraft during the war, and began flying routes the major carriers considered too small or too remote to bother with. Some of these so-called non-scheduled airlines, or non-skeds as pilots called them at the time, operated on razor-thin margins, flying charter routes for returning servicemen, cargo runs for struggling regional businesses, even seasonal agricultural work hauling crops between harvest and market. Most of these tiny operators eventually folded or were absorbed into larger carriers. But a handful survived, grew, and became the regional and even international airlines that still carry passengers today, their corporate histories quietly tracing back to a single surplus Dakota purchased for a few $1,000s on a government auction lot in 1946. Without the C-47 flooding the market at fire sale prices, the post-war boom in small independent airlines simply could not have happened, because no other aircraft on Earth offered that same combination of capability and affordability. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this moment in aviation history really was, because it would never happen again quite the same way. Every war since has ended with military aircraft either too specialized for civilian use, too classified to release, or too expensive to convert. But in 1945, the United States found itself holding the one thing a devastated global economy desperately needed: a fleet of proven, reliable, easily maintained transport aircraft that had already been paid for by wartime taxpayers and could now be sold for a fraction of their true value simply to clear it off government balance sheets. Economists studying post-war reconstruction have pointed to the aircraft surplus disposal program as one of the quieter but more significant accelerants of global economic recovery, because it gave dozens of struggling nations a functioning air transport network almost overnight, without those nations needing to spend scarce post-war capital building one from scratch. Countries recovering from occupation, from bombing campaigns, from years of frozen infrastructure investment, suddenly had access to modern air transport simply by buying second-hand American war surplus. In a very real sense, the C-47 helped rebuild the connective tissue of the post-war world, one surplus airframe at a time, long before the first Marshall Plan dollars ever arrived. The legacy of all of this reaches directly into the aviation industry you interact with today, even if you've never noticed it. Every modern regional airline model, the idea that smaller, cheaper aircraft can profitably connect underserved communities to larger hub cities, traces its commercial roots back to those scrappy post-war operators flying surplus Dakotas into airstrips no major carrier would touch. The entire concept of budget air cargo, of small operators using rugged, affordable aircraft to serve routes too thin for the big players, was essentially invented by pilots flying $2,500 war surplus transports in the late 1940s. Even now, in the third decade of the 21st century, more than 100 DC-3 and C-47 airframes remain in active flight operations somewhere in the world, some still hauling cargo commercially, over 80 years after the type first took to the air. Museums across the globe preserve dozens more, painted in the liberation livery of D-Day, or the battered service colors of the airlines they helped build. Collectors restore them not as relics, but as flying machines that still, remarkably, make economic sense in the right corner of the world. Few, if any, aircraft designs from the 1930s can make that claim. So the next time you board a regional flight to some small city that a major airline would never bother serving, or you see a battered cargo plane loading freight at the edge of an airport far from the main terminal, remember where that entire idea came from. It came from a field full of 10,000 grounded warplanes in 1945, a government desperate to unload them, and a price tag so low that ordinary people with nothing but ambition and a pilot's license could suddenly own a piece of the sky. The C-47 didn't just survive the end of the war. It quietly rebuilt an entire industry out of the wreckage, one $2,500 airplane at a time, and it never really stopped flying. If this story surprised you, you are only scratching the surface of what happened to the mountains of surplus equipment left behind after the Second World War. Somewhere out there is another forgotten airfield, another abandoned stockpile, another decision made in 1945 that quietly shaped the world you live in today. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden histories, make sure you're subscribed, because the next untold story is already waiting to take off.